Are you frustrated at being stuck at what feels like a beginner level of drawing for way too long? When we start drawing as adults, we quite naturally start with picking up the habits of drawing we developed as children. And I believe it's these childhood habits, particularly the childhood ways of thinking about the drawing process. While appropriate for childhood, as adults, they hold us back from progressing our drawing to a more advanced level. We need to go beyond these childhood ways of thinking and drawing and develop more sophisticated ones that contain all the possibilities that we would desire for our future drawings. I have 8 ways that we can develop these more adult ways of thinking about the drawing process now. The biggest challenge with this first new way of thinking is that you really probably think you don't need to. But it's that the level of observation we got used to with our reference as a child drawing simply isn't enough, both in the time we spend and the way we spend observing, simply isn't enough for us to be able to create the drawings as adults that we want to create. The very first place we need to get more value from the time we spend doing is observing our reference. We have to make sure that we observe all of the points we need to observe for the part of the drawing we're doing at that point. And then when we've drawn them, we need to reference back and check to see, is it correct or not? Can I adjust it or not? Or can I compensate a little bit for it in the next part of the drawing I move on to? I don't know if you've seen my video where I do this drawing, but I'm able to do it because I've developed my ability to observe shapes and proportions enough so that I have a better chance of accurately drawing them on the paper and then observing things such as the gaps between items as I draw, and then establishing various smaller sections of my drawing scene, which I can then start to use now more confidently as a reference point by checking alignments to see where various parts of the reference line up horizontally or vertically with other parts, particularly parts I've already drawn. All of this requires a lot more careful observation, but it gives us an understanding of our subject. It gives us an accuracy in understanding its form that we don't get in a shorter, more superficial look. I believe that often if what we've drawn isn't a good representation of what's in our reference, the fault actually lies in our not having observed the reference carefully enough to draw it well. We should not rush to blame our drawing skills when in fact it's our observation skills that need to be developed further. The second bad habit we've often picked up from childhood is related to the first, and that's we're in such a rush to get our pen making a mark on the paper that we haven't worked out where it needs to go, what we're trying to do with it, and the best way of getting our drawing to its end point. We have our reference and we rush to start copying it. We need more time, not just in our initial observing of our reference and then thought before we actually start drawing, but we also need more looking at our paper before we draw and working out, where do I want things to go? Are things lining up properly? Am I creating the effect that I wanted? Even before we put pen on paper, from our reference, we can make some decisions. Are there changes that need to be made? I shifted all of these figures and at least one, if not two of these 3 lamps in order to create what I thought was a better overall visual impact. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I'd rushed to drawing all of these elements without that overall consideration of what I'm doing from the very start. This next one is we have to stop seeing our subject of shapes that need outlining and to see them as 3-dimensional forms that we need to create on our paper. I suspect that because for many of us, our drawing journey starts with copying cartoons, it certainly did for me, it creates this emphasis. For instance, with this bench, I can just see it as a shape that I need to outline, or I can see it as a 3-dimensional form. which is moving away from me in space and creates different effects according to where we're looking at it from. And instead, we seek to capture the 3 dimensions of what we're seeing, because our focus is on 3-dimensional form rather than 2-dimensional shape. And this can give us a much better outcome for our drawing. The 4th point is that we have to stop thinking of drawings as something we create with lines, because that gives us a predetermining to emphasize lines, to focus on lines, to draw lines, lots of lines. And at best, what we're going to have is our lines looking accurate in relation to our reference. But I think a far more sophisticated way of thinking, and one which will lead to significantly more advanced level drawings, is instead of thinking of lines, to think of marks. Some of our marks will be lines. But even when we do draw lines, they won't be such emphatic lines as a beginner might so easily do. We'll be looking beyond the lines to trying to capture effects, and therefore we're going to need more than just lines in our toolbox. We're going to need all manner of marks that we can put on the paper. And even when we're drawing architecture, with less of a focus on line, we can create more sophisticated effects, such as a softer feel where this building meets the ground, which lets the ornateness of the cornice of the building stand out more. It allows us to have a single focus in this drawing by keeping the detail down here, if you like, muffled by the marks we've chosen to make. And for some subjects, drawing lines is always problematic. And I think that's why beginners find drawing trees such a challenge, or natural scenes such as this such a challenge. Because an emphasis on outline is going to be very problematic in drawing this scene. But if we're thinking of marks, creating effect, which I'll talk more about, we now have many more tools at our disposal to create this scene. And if you're finding these points helpful, then please help me by hitting the like button, by sharing this video with your friends who draw. And if you haven't subscribed, of course, why not plan to check out a few more of my videos? And I would love for you to leave a comment telling me which of these 8 ways of thinking you think is going to be most significant for your moving up to the next level of your drawing. And I mentioned this next point in passing in the last point, and that's when we're children, we tend to feel that the way we draw is to draw everything we see. And that works fine if we're drawing a cartoon character. But as adults, if that's our thinking, we soon come to grief when we have scenes of incredible detail, when we have subjects of incredible detail, where quite frankly, we have more detail if we look at it than we could ever effectively draw. And this particularly happens in nature with its abundance of elements. So instead of our childhood focus on objects that we have to draw, to focus on the effect of what we're seeing, and then what marks can I use to capture that on my paper, is a far more sophisticated way of approaching our reference. And it's one that opens the door to developing way more effects of capturing not just an outline, but the sense of 3 dimensions and the overall effect of the scene. And this is a good example of focusing on 3 dimensions, on focusing on marks rather than lines to create objects, particularly complex objects, and on seeking always to draw the effect of what we're seeing, whether it's an edge, whether it's a mass of similar shapes, and focusing on capturing the effect of what we're looking at, not an exactness, not an outlining of all the forms, but the overall effect. I have a playlist on this one point, which is possibly one of the most important points of this video, if you're interested in understanding more how we can draw the effect of what we see rather than the detail of what we see. And in the videos, I demonstrate this in many, many different subjects. This next way of thinking flows very naturally from the previous one, and that's that I need to stop thinking in terms of symbols or patterns. And again, I believe this very much flows from our childhood drawing habits, particularly if we started off drawing by copying cartoons, particularly where there's complex detail, into patterns and symbols, and it's easy to unwittingly adopt these. When we have grass, it's very common for people to draw something like this. And what this is really is a symbol that at some stage in our past we came to think of as representing a tuft of grass. So therefore, when we see grass in our reference, we're not thinking, how can I create the effect of what I'm seeing? We're thinking, oh, grass, yes, I know what grass looks like. Grass looks like this. Instead of thinking, how can I capture that effect with my marks? We see leaves and we think, oh, leaves, yes, okay, I do leaves this way. And so we use line to outline what we see as a two-dimensional form, and then we use a pattern that we've developed for the leaves inside. Of course, it means all our trees end up looking the same, regardless of what sort of tree there is, because we haven't developed the habit of different marks for different foliage. And we won't be able to until we first learn to observe our reference and see the various characteristics of different types of trees. Once we observe the different types of leaves that we're seeing really carefully, we have a chance of working out what marks and the way I put them on the paper can I use to create the effect of the different foliage that I see on different trees. And I can develop a style which doesn't depend on outline and pattern, but of creating marks that capture the effect that often particularly includes capturing the lighting effect more effectively. Don't forget to share in the comments which of these points you found most challenging as one that you can start to apply to help push your drawing up to its next level. But this point is that we need to start thinking, considering, strategizing our reference as a whole rather than start to just jump to drawing parts of it. It's like starting to write an essay without any idea of a plan or where you're hoping to end up. Once we start to think that as artists, we're doing more than copying a reference. We're challenged with how are we going to improve on the reference? How are we going to create the effects that we see here? And before we can do that, we have to work out what they are and what we would like to do. I really wanted to emphasize the distance between these backpackers down the front here and the castle up on the crag. I wanted to have a sense of this downhill winding movement of the street. And while I'm not overly fond of drawing cars, I realized that they were going to be an important part of this scene, and so I needed to particularly pay attention to them. I also noticed that this line here roughly is halfway across, and because I was doing my freehand drawing same size, that therefore I would want this to be in the center, and that helped me with my spacing and my observation as I moved across from the left. And choosing particularly to focus on the depth of plane in this scene, I particularly strategized how I would create that. The most obvious method by using a thicker pen for these closest elements, and then a lighter pen for the ones a bit further away, and then the finest one again for the furthest objects. And it was a similar thing with the values, with the lights and darks that I created, that the darkest ones sit closer forward and the lighter ones will move further back. I make all these decisions as well as spending a few minutes actually experimenting with the sort of marks I think might be helpful, the ways I'm trying to depict certain effects, perhaps just to get a sense of proportion and see whether I'm going to go too high, too low, too wide by natural inclination. This is the experimentation that I did for this, just to make sure that the sort of marks I was thinking of and some of the effects I was going to create would look the way I hoped they would look. It also helps me work out whether the pen I'm planning to use is too fine or too thick. I may play around with marks to a greater extent, but the important thing with this step is that it forces me to observe my reference more carefully. It slows me down from rushing to put marks on the paper before I have enough information in my head to create the effect that I want to start with and that I want to build with. It also lets me strategize how I'm going to build this effect, whether I'll be using the same materials or whether I'll be changing materials at different stages. The drawing is a process where the whole drawing appears rather than a section that I commit to heavily with lines and just move across the page. I'm continually adjusting the visual effects over the whole drawing until I feel that the whole drawing and all the marks that I've put on and all the effects I've created capture what I was wanting to capture. This last point is not to be overly literal of our photo reference, to feel free as we look and analyze and work out what interpretation of our reference we want to create in our drawing, that we feel free to choose a style and to make choices that go beyond our scene, that go beyond our reference. We may leave much of our reference out and choose the details that create the effect, that highlight the effect we want. I already mentioned how I felt free in this drawing to relocate all of these figures and a few of these lampposts to create a less exact copy of my reference, but more importantly, to create a better interpretation for my drawing. And not being overly literal in what we try and draw from our reference, I think is even more important, is particularly important in any scene of overwhelming detail, of capturing the effects, of simplifying some areas, leaving some out altogether, and adjusting our values, whichever way we apply them, to create focal points of interest that our scene might not have had in the reference. These are all ways of thinking where I've shifted my earlier thinking of what drawing is and how it happens. And I believe that these are the ways of thinking that have enabled me to advance my drawing from what was at best fairly accurate, but at worst fairly lifeless, into, I believe, far more advanced outcomes. And can I say, far more satisfying to create. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I'm so convinced that these ways of thinking are the ways of thinking we need to develop to move from a more childhood-based way of thinking about drawing to develop the thought processes and the techniques that we need to have to create the more sophisticated drawing effects that we can see in our mind. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope this was a helpful video for you. Please tell me in the comments which you think is going to make the most impact on your drawing. But look, however you draw and whatever you draw, what time you draw it in, or what thinking you put into the drawing, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.